Welcome to your iconic image. If you want to take control of your image and be a power player in your space, then this is the show for you. Here we will arm you with tools and information to help you grow your brand on purpose. I'm your host, Marlana Semenza, photographer and visual strategist. Now let's dive into today's episode. Anshar Seraphim teaches high-stakes negotiation, persuasive psychology, neuromarketing, interpersonal dynamics, and communication. He can teach you not only how to close a sale, but to build trust, rapport, and make one-time customers into lifetime clients. So if you're looking to hone your negotiation skills and learn how the power of psychology, neuroscience, and interpersonal dynamics can help change the face of the way you do business, this is the man you need. Welcome, Anshar.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. So tell me, why is it so helpful to know our personality type?
Well, you have a timeline. Basically, it's kind of like a spectrum. Some people argue that sexuality is on a spectrum, or that introversion and extroversion are on a spectrum. There are actually a few different elements of personality that are on a spectrum, and these are identified by Carl Jung a long time ago. And it's not just introversion and extroversion, but it's also intuition and sensing. So, do you process things, with internal systems in your brain, or are you focused on observing your environment? And then you have thinking and feeling, which I think most people have, a grasp of how those can kind of go on the spectrum. And then the last is perceiving and judging, which means do you take different things and compare them to one another, or are you interested in looking at things in their own context? And these are biases that, in psychology, you can make the argument that almost up to 75% of personality can be genetic. So what you're really doing is you're trying to identify the nature and nurture of your own psychology, the way that you evaluate things. You may function better with metaphors, you may function better with narratives, you may function better with emotional or social proof. We're all convinced by different things. And one of the fundamental problems, because we have a kind of a default in our society of trying to treat other people the way that we want to be treated. And that's a great ethos, but it really only works when we're dealing with an absolute stranger and we're just trying to make sure that we're considerate of them and we treat them the best way possible. So we try to project our own value system on them. But when you start to get into psychology, you'll start to understand that that's not the reality. The reality is that we all learn a different way. We all express ourselves a different way. We all use different processes in our judgment in a different way. And so understanding your own cognitive biases from your personality, how you best communicate, it can help you identify the kinds of people that you're going to have difficulty reaching with your default communication style. If for example, your personality type's really good at conveying things through metaphor, but you come across another person who doesn't use metaphor at all, you'll actually throw them off by doing that. One of the things when we move into training and sales, because I've been doing sales now for about 2 decades now, is, when someone gets first started in sales, the first earmark of getting successful with sales is learning a spiel, learning toolbox phrases, learning about your product or your service, being able to answer the most common questions. And you usually do that in your own voice. But when you move past that and you already know what to say, then you can focus on how to say it. And that's where things get interesting, because when you start to understand the emotional and cognitive motivations that go behind behavior, what actually drives people to action, what creates a response in the amygdala, what creates memory resonance, what creates dopamine pathways, you start to understand that you can't use the same strategy with everyone. The same technique that you can use to close one person will actually block another. And so when you start to move on to more advanced sales, more advanced negotiation, more advanced psychology, you start to identify how not only your own biases affect the conversation, but you'll also start to recognize patterns. Personality science and dynamics can get very complicated, but one of the interesting things about running a business or doing marketing or branding or going through a sales process is you're not concerning yourself with all of psychology. What you're really trying to do is look at the agonist, the antecedent, your product, your service, and what is the way that most people are going to react to that. And that's the only part of psychology that you need to worry about at first, which is How are people going to see your brand, your message, your personage? What are the most common reactions to that? What do those different manifestations of reaction look like? And then what information can we get from that? And when we work in sales, even if it's like a storefront or we're fielding emails or talking to clients, you'll start to hear a lot of the same kinds of responses to the information that you have to offer. And then you'll understand that different types of people with different perspectives or different needs are going to respond to your product or service in that particular way. And then you can start to mentally plan ahead and know what to do when that reaction happens. And I think all of that starts with your own personal inventory of understanding your own personality, because that's going to be conveyed in your image and your brand as well.
So, okay, I know my personality, I know my personality type. So how do I lean into that to grow my, let's say, personal brand?
So just to take a step back for your listeners and your viewers, I was talking about those particular dynamics. That those are based off of the Jung archetypes, and so that was kind of developed in much the same way. You go back, I think it's Danish or either 1850s in Denmark or something like that. You had people who were statisticians and census takers who were interested in things about bodies. And so they learned to apply the body mass index. And you can ask a doctor, you start to look closer at that. It's not necessarily a good indicator of health. It just kind of gives you an idea. Well, personality science is the same. When Carl Jung first talked about it, he identified 16 different personality types, introversion, extroversion, intuitives, all of that. And then he also made the earmark of saying, we have an unconscious personality type, and then we have a conscious personality type. And what that means is that you have the ability, depending on the situation that you're in, to create earmarks and changes to your personality. And a lot of us do it without thinking about it. If you're an introverted person, you take a public speaking class, or maybe you're not super fantastic with sales or with numbers and concrete ideas. And say you take a sales or negotiation class, you're in the process of creating a new personality that you're going to use in that specific situation. And you'll see it in the affectations of the person. If a person goes up for public speaking, let's say, and they're an introvert, you're going to see them use completely different gesticulations, completely different facial expressions, different idioms. And so you have control over your own personality. And the best way to showcase it, and you'll be able to identify your strengths and your weaknesses in that way. And so part of building your own brand is building the personality of that brand. And I think that when we go through the process of doing that, a lot of us make the mistake of selling ourselves. We think that that's the objective, that we want to find all of the unique and wonderful things about ourselves, transmit that to someone else. But there's a critical error there. And that's that the first person that we always have to think about is who we're talking to. We have to create an avatar of the different kinds of people who are going to be interested in our information, what their common pain points, dreams, objections, hopes, fears, desires are. And then we have to be able to target those things to be able to reach those people. And when we take our personal inventory, that's when we identify our strengths, because we want to be able to talk to those specific people to be able to impress upon them the importance of your good or service. And that's where being selective is important. I think a good metaphor is, if you like metaphors, is Stephanie Meyer, when she wrote Twilight. She really thought about her target audience. She was writing a vampire romance novel for teenage girls. So she had to think to herself, okay, so I have to use language that's accessible to teenagers. I need to use imagery that's accessible to teenagers. But she also did something really smart. When she started talking about Bella, the character, she was very, very devoid of specific details, even though she was speaking in the first person. And that's so that everyone who was looking and at that story and reading it had the ability to put themselves into that role. And that's one of the reasons that the book was so successful. So I think it's about getting into your prospect's head and understanding what it is that's important to them. and then identifying that, because sometimes you'll serve vastly different groups of people. When I work with entrepreneurs or C-suites, they have to be able to not only communicate the buy-in from, but I mean, a very diverse group of people, everything from highly educated people that they can go into great detail with, to people that they have to get incremental buy-in from. And you have to identify, what camp do the people that you are most trying to reach, what camp do they follow? And then you have to create a communication strategy based off of that. And anytime that you create a communication strategy, you have to think about your own assets and weaknesses. And I think that starts with personal inventory. So talking about the Jungian archetype, we use the Myers-Briggs for that. Myers-Briggs, they weren't psychologists themselves. They examined, Jung's research and tried to come up with an easy, systematic way of being able to map that. And it's not a pigeonhole. Once you identify what your strengths and weaknesses are, then you can capitalize on those to create a public persona, to be able to work on your weaknesses, to be able to better reach your target audience. And I think that's a key part of developing your own brand, because it's what starts the narrative of the sale, the negotiation, or the conversation about your good or service.
So I did take the test and I came up as an INFJ. So does that mean that I am always, I guess when you said before that I can be different things in different situations,
Sure.
Does that INFJ stay at the core all the time, or?
Sure. I'll discuss that. What's interesting about INFJ is it's actually the rarest personality type. It's kind of like being Sherlock Holmes, but with emotions and feelings. And what's interesting is your average INFJ is so natural in the process of empathy that they don't even realize that they're doing it. And the reason you have to be aware of it is that if you get an NT type, you get someone who's very concrete and logical, like myself, I'm an INTJ, it's more difficult for me to connect to emotional states. And a person who doesn't know you very well, when you start to turn that empathy on, they can feel scrutinized by that. And so you have to be able to watch your reaction. But once you have that baseline, you know that you're a highly intuitive empath, essentially, then you start to learn some things about yourself. For example, as an INFJ, if you're really careful about the things that are in your environment. INFJs are the people who have to look at themselves in the mirror and talk themselves into something, where, have a motivational poster on the wall, or, they can't listen to the wrong song on the radio because it'll put a bad mood for the day. There's, you have to take a little bit more care with your narrative. And I think the stark difference between an INTJ and an INFJ, because we're two introverted types have a lot in common. But the fact that you have a focus on emotions and I have a focus on the concrete means that there are specific situations where we're going to have a communication disconnect. And I think that's exciting. The only way that we're able to grow is when we can identify the gaps that we have, the situations that we don't excel in. And we want to put ourselves into the situations as much as we can under the most favorable circumstances that we can. I think we've all had that experience in sales where, it's almost like a light comes down and everything is easy. And we just, we sell our good, our product or service, get every add-on, everything you possibly get. And when you're done, you're celebrating. But at the same time, you're asking yourself, why can't all the sales be like that? And, 20 years of experience for me has been finding the answer to that question. And the answer is that when people are more like you, they give you imaginary credibility. When you sit down and you have a similar background, a similar way of looking at the world, or a similar experience, we start to move closer to one another in our peer groups. It affects us sociologically. And if you can understand as an INFJ how to focus on different parts of your personality so that you can relate to people, especially the people that are hardest for you to relate to, then you'll be able to start those conversations on the right foot and put your skills to the best use. And then whatever it is that you work on, that is that conscious personality. So whether it's you focusing on being comfortable speaking in front of 100 people, or being comfortable dealing with a really intense, fact-based person who's not going to be emotionally swayed or convinced, they have cognitive dissonance that they have to get over. That's really important. But I think the other part of it is, I think the thing that holds people back the most from success is their own objections, their own cognitive belief systems. And you have to discover and be a detective and figure out what kinds of beliefs you have as far as your business venture is concerned. Whether or not those beliefs are actually rooted in fact, you have to be able to test them, and which of them are standing in your way, and which of them you can work on. And it all starts with personal inventory. So that's why I tell people to take their own personality test. And there's lots of different ones out there. I have a preference to the Jungian one just because it's so widespread, it's so ubiquitous that it's very easy to identify the different communication styles, what different type combinations look like. But there are a number of other different types of personality systems out there. I think the primary takeaway is understanding that your personality is conveyed in your brain, whether you want it to or not, and that you have to figure out whether or not that personality stands as an impediment to the people that you're trying to reach. And if it does, what do you need to work on, change, alter, or present differently in order to be able to not exclude those people?
Oh, interesting. So let's say I meet someone.
Mhm.
How do we, if it's all fine and good that we know our own personality type, but how do we identify in someone else how they need information communicated to them?
Well, people give you all kinds of clues. And one of them is that we all operate off of that fundamental problem of trying to treat other people like the way that we want to be treated. You see in relationships too, I might be that person who I feel super loved in a relationship when I come home and the kitchen is spotless, because it means that someone puts some real effort into something that matters in my space or something like that. But if I then clean the kitchen to show my partner that I care about them, and that's not important to them, I could literally spend all day on something and feel very proud of it. And then they walk in the front door, and that's not important to them at all. They walk right past it. And that's how communication problems arise. So, I think that personal inventory starts there. But the other part of it is that your product or service is going to cause specific psychological reactions in different times. For example, and I'm sure that you struggle with this because you're the industry that you're in. When you're talking to people about their brand, if they're intensely introverted and logical, they may be convinced that the thing that they're interested in selling is going to be able to pass on its own merit because it's a strong idea. And they don't understand that someone needs to see a face that they can trust, that there are a set of emotional objections that need to happen before someone's willing to listen to that. Maybe some people need social proof. They need to see other people, underwriting, your credibility, your trust. You have to go through those different, because we all have different emotional objections when we want to approach something: reassurance, accomplishment, character maintenance, immortality, self-identity, and trust. Reassurance. I need to be reassured that I have enough information and that I have enough executive power to be able to make a decision before I feel confident doing it. Otherwise, I need to research more. Accomplishment. Is this thing going to take care of the concrete goals that I have or not? Character maintenance. Am I going to be socially elevated or socially denigrated by others based on this service, based on spending money? Come from a market bazaar economy in the Middle East, and the amount of money that they spend on something affects their self-esteem. Then you get into immortality. What's the pervasive value for this going to be? Is this going to be a drop in the bucket and it's the pleasure and it's gone? Or is this going to be persistent value? And some people will only spend that money, time, or effort if it's persistent value. Self-identity. Is it a solution that speaks to me specifically, or what I'm selling, what I'm doing? Because if it doesn't appeal to my unique needs, then it's essentially worthless. And then trust. Does a person actually trust you with authority on that thing to give you that power to be able to affect their narrative? And sometimes people don't know what their emotional objections are. And that can be a problem when you're coming up with your own brand too, if you don't know what your own objections are. Maybe you're intimidated by website design, and so you convince yourself that you don't need a website. Or maybe you're intimidated by being in front of a camera and lots of pictures of your face, so you don't put pictures of your product. I once worked with an Italian energy company, and their entire website had not a single human face on it because they believed, as engineers, that providing value proposition to other people would be enough to catch their attention. And that can certainly work on certain demographic people, but not all people. So I think that sapience is really important for that reason. It changes your presentation. It changes the different things that you look for. in your product, but it also starts to make more sense of that formula that you see where people make themselves present on different types of social media platforms. They speak to different parts of their target demographic. They have social underwriting from trusted sources to show they're trustworthy. I think that one of the cool things about studying psychology is you understand certain things, but you don't necessarily put them in context until you get immersed in that information. But sometimes we speak to the people that might not need our advice as much as the people who really need it. If you look at the bell curve distribution, say we have an average IQ of 98 to 105 in our culture, that means with that bell curve distribution that 15% of the population has an 85 or lower IQ. Are you coming up with a message that comes across to them too? There's a reason that people put the price and value proposition over and over, get multiple opportunities, multiple buttons, because it's almost like a check question. Have I overcome that? Have I done that in a simplistic enough way? Am I speaking with the right audience? And that's by packaging up the things that you do and putting them into different places and creating systems of arriving at that place that are different for your different avatars. That can be really important because let's say you have two target demographics that are vastly different. Maybe you need to have a completely different web page, even though you're offering exactly the same service. One narrative for one person, one narrative for the other. And I think examining that process is the only way if you can determine that you're going to be able to do that. And part of that is examining yourself. It all starts with you.
Let me ask you this, because this question arose when you were speaking. Let's say we have a product or service and we are looking to grow our brand. Should we pay closer attention to the thing that we fight the most on? Let's say, for example, if you said the company that you were working with in Italy didn't have one image of a person, or the people that think that I don't need to be the face of my brand or company because it's irrelevant. The thing that we dig our heels in the most, should we give that closer attention? Could that be something that really needs our attention?
I think that people get so motivated and so bought because it's hard to get people to take action. So when they finally do, it's usually because they're drinking their own Kool-Aid. And we can forget that other people will look at what we do in a completely different way. And I think the most neglected step is market research. Once you have an idea of who it is that you're speaking to, that's important, then you need to find a grouping of very, very honest or very, very random people with a large enough sample size who come from that demographic. And then you need to listen completely divested of your own emotional idea and just listen to what they have to say. And there are lots of different services and stuff out there that will offer that for you. There are places that you can go that will pay each person who goes to take a look at your, consume this amount of time, they'll pay $4 or whatever. And they will talk about completely without you there, their impression of your site. How is the information, is it coming across? What is this product? There's an old saying in business, if you can't explain your business value proposition to a 6-year-old and then have them explain it to another 6-year-old and have both of those 6-year-olds understand what it is that you're selling, not only are you going to have difficulty selling it, but you may not have narrowed down that message well enough to be able to transmit it. Because we have to take things down to their basic essence first. You have to incrementally get people bought into the steps. And you always try to not overwhelm them too. You want to try to focus on the smallest front-facing part of what it is that you do in order to get them involved in the narrative. And then their own interest will take them further than that.
Love it. So how do you said that we get different clues from different people on what their communication style is, so how do we pull on those threads to start to bridge the gap and make the connections?
So first, you have to identify what the biggest difficulties in communicating from your perspective to a different perspective are. And then you need to address those. What are they specifically? You be able to itemize them, identify them. A lot of us can tell when we're not getting through to someone, but we don't always know why. And I think that's about listening. One of the other things that we do in sales a lot is we work on check questions. It's very important before you move from one step of the process to the next, that you take a second and engage interest. Take a second, make sure that there are no more questions. Take a second, make sure that you're on the same page. Because sometimes we can be so excited about getting to the finish line that we don't let other people put on their boots. And when you're selling something that's fairly simple or self-demonstrative, self-explanatory, it can be easy. But one of the hardest things, especially if you're coming to market with a new product or you're trying to show what it is about you that's different, you have to get people to follow along long enough to be able to not only be interested in that, but know why that's important. Why is it important for you to be different? Why is it important for you to be unique? And we talked about at the beginning, people try to sell themselves. It's not about selling yourself. It's about finding people that you're serving, finding what it is that you're going to be able to do for them, and then finding what's unique about you that you'll be able to do to be able to promulgate that. And that's when you come in. I think we get wrapped up in our own ego and just think that we need to sell ourselves. And I think maybe social media is putting us in that perspective too.
I think you read all the messages in my head and the things that I say to my clients, because I always say that what I do for them is I bridge the gap in images between what makes you unique and what your audience needs to know. And so when we know these bits of information about ourselves, how do we lean into the things that are serving us, or do we try and shore up the things that are not? Or is it kind of a delicate balance?
I think that if you can create a list, for example, of things that you really want your prospect to know or to be on the same page with, and you listen for that feedback from doing market research, you're going to find the parts of your message that are already easily conveyed. If it's a fairly simple product or service, maybe someone already knows what it is and why they want it. But sometimes they don't know what the benefits of doing it professionally are, or sometimes they don't know the benefits of actually investing in that, or, you have to be able to identify what their objections are. And I think that's what guides you. If you start with the people that you're aiming your product or service at, and you move backwards from that, if you can evaluate a successful sale, a successful interaction, and then move backward from the desired result, sometimes that can obviate some of the steps that you're missing. And I think that step of going backward is really important too, because sometimes we forget things along the breadcrumb trail. We forget that social connections, for example, are an important part of reaching the goals. Ask yourself, who would be a great person to underwrite this product? Who speaks to this demographic that I'm talking to that is going to help them trust me? And how do I connect with that person? Does that person have gatekeepers? And that's how we get into the mindset for public relations and marketing too. I don't think a lot of people know this, but a lot of people have never heard of a guy named Edward Bernays. Have you?
No.
So he's the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And, while a lot of Freud's theories, have been kind of discarded as we move through with psychology, his tangential exposure to psychology made him ask the question, how do we use psychology to affect the world of business? And if you go back to Edward Bernays' time, a lot of people think of him as the father of public relations. And, sometimes we have a negative impression of it because it involves smoking, something we don't necessarily think positively of now. But back in his time, it was very negatively perceived for women to smoke. And so he started thinking about group dynamics, sociology, psychology, and he would go to women's liberation and freedom marches, and he would pay women to smoke and call them torches of freedom.
Huh.
And then he went into, with a lot of the entertainment industry and started to get the tobacco companies to start integrating, promoting cigarettes into their media. And every time that there was a strong or assertive woman, or someone who's being assertive with their sexuality, they put a cigarette in their hand. That's why a lot of those black and white movies have an aggressive woman having a cigarette in their hand. And it changed the cultural perception of the product. So he learned how to use psychology to not only change the way that his product was perceived, but to be able to create a demand for it. Why do these people who don't want my good or service, why do they not want it? Well, it's got a negative social perception. Well, how do I address that? Who do I need to reach to address that? How do I change the public narrative? What kinds of things are people, looking up to for their behavior? And if you do that with your product or service, you'll have a completely different perspective of how to approach it. But if it means taking your own ego out of it and realizing that it's about who it is that you're trying to serve first and yourself after.
Fascinating. So let me ask you this. Is it more beneficial to, let's say, the sales that went really well? Here's our avatar and everything is swimming along. Is it more beneficial to get feedback from them or get feedback from the people that we perceive as our avatar but have objections, to find out what their objections are, or to kind of marry the two?
I think it's both. I think that one of the most important things about staying on top of your own sales process, staying on top of your own image, is you always want to be asking yourself after what went well and what could have gone better. And I think that that's why peer dynamics are so important. You want to involve yourself in a group of fellow entrepreneurs or someone in the weight industry, or because you want to be able to bounce that process off of someone else. And if you don't have it, you can speak to a house plant or the family dog or whatever, but you have to go verbally into that process. And it does a couple of things for you. The first, and you learn a little bit about this when you study psychology and cognitive neuroscience, but emotional priming for memory. The memory system of the human brain is basically a stress recording machine. Evolutionarily, as cortisol goes up, as we start to get stressed out by stuff in our environment, memory system goes into overdrive because it's like, oh, here's something that might help us survive in the future. If you get chased up a tree by a lion, it'll be a while before you forget about that. And that same evolutionary system that served us in the wild also has us, on our pillows with one eye open at 2:00 in the morning saying, man, that job interview I had 10 years ago went super terrible. It's very easy for us to remember all of our failures, but not necessarily all of our successes. And that can kind of change our cognitive belief system, because if the only thing that you remember are negative experiences, are failures, or challenges, and you don't take the time to dwell in and celebrate positive successes, you're going to have a very, very warped view, not just of your own success, but of yourself. And it's very important to kind of countermand that biological process. And it also, by examining whether things went well or could have gone better or whatever, you can identify missed opportunities. You can recognize patterns. And you have to have a person in your life that's asking you the right questions. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be a sales or negotiation trainer, but so how did that person, find you? How did the conversation start? What were their initial concerns? What were their initial questions? Did you notice anything, that stood out about them? And did you use that information when you were presenting and closing the sale? What could have gone better or differently, even when you have a success? Let's diagnose that. Because sometimes if a person says yes, they could have said yes to a lot more. And, inexperienced salespeople will be happy and excited. And a sales manager will sit there with their arms crossed, like, man, we could have sold $10,000 more if we'd asked the right questions. I used to do engagement rank training for Kay and Jared. I used to ask sales associates, did you sell a 2-carat diamond today? And they'd say, well, no. And I said, well, how many 2-carat diamonds did you present today? And they're like, none. I said, well, how are you going to sell a 2-carat diamond if you never show one? You have to come up with a way of being able to get yourself through that process and find out what your goals and your outcomes and what you want out of that process are. And then I think you have to diagnose that with someone else. I think sometimes having that person have a different personality with you or a different approach is good because you get a different insight. But even the process of just going through what you already know will help you celebrate your successes and have a more balanced view of your business model. I think that's crucial.
And I just have to ask this because I just have to. Let's say as we go through At what point, or does it depend on the personality? At what point can we ask for a sale?
Well, I think that, I was talking about agonists and antecedents. Agonist is kind of a broad term from organic chemistry, but a huge nerd. So when we have something that affects our prospects, they're all going to react in certain psychological ways. For example, one of the stupid human tricks that I can do, because I have autism, so I like puzzles. It's one of my special interests. And if I go to like a coffee shop or something like that, and I do a Rubik's Cube, I can do one in like 90 seconds. I will get the same 8 or 9 comments from all the people who watch me. It'll be, I just take the stickers off, or I used to take that apart as a kid, or I knew someone do that, or I used to be able to do that when I was younger, or they'll make like a denigrating joke to make themselves feel better, or they'll just choose the topic, or there's a few specific psychological reactions. And I was speaking with Steve Sims not that long ago. He talked about being a bouncer as a doorman, and he learned to identify specific characteristics in the people that were coming up to the door that would tell them if they were going to start trouble, if they were going to spend money, or what their response to that is. So I think that once you have a stable situation going on with your funnel, you're going to have a specific set of reactions that happen to that, and then you need to be able to deep dive into each one of those reactions and see how they're helping your sales process and whether or not the close looks different. Chat questions are also really good because they can kind of help you identify where you're at. A trial close is really important. We sometimes think that we're only supposed to close at the end. If you try closing in the middle and you do it in a non-pressured way, then as long as you're keeping that conversation positive and you're in sync with that person, they'll bring up things that you haven't discussed yet, the things that are important to them. A trial close is really important because it lets you know where you are. If you're running a big enough organization that you have multiple salespeople, it can also be, and perfect turnover happens before the sales process starts, before you start investing in that. But sometimes you don't know. If you have someone else to turn over to, maybe he's a better fit, or explains a particular objection or something better, or a team sell, or, you have to know what your options are. In order to figure that out, you have to figure out what you are. I think that the most damaging thing that we can do is we can jump into a spiel. And if we're just giving the same exact words, phrases, inflections, facial expressions, and it's common for introverts, I'm sure you get yourself in a particular situation, and it's almost like a lunchbox and you're pulling out specific phrases that you know to use in that situation, because otherwise being in an extroverted situation can be overwhelming. But you've got to identify, what it is that you need to say so that you can change how it is that you say it depending on the person that you're talking to. And that's when we move up to the next level. It's when we start to incorporate, psychology. We start to understand people's biases. I think one of the hardest things is, I'll paraphrase Jonathan Swift here. You can't talk someone out of something using logic if they didn't use logic to talk themselves into it in the first place. And I think, as an INFJ, that's more of a powerhouse for you, because you can change the emotional narrative. You can see if someone's stuck on a feeling, but you may not necessarily recognize the cognitive systems. And that's where, an NT type comes in. You got to be able to use your strengths in that way. We talk about using our personality strengths. You'll have a really good sense of the emotional narrative. And that's one of the other reasons that even if you're doing it online marketing, it's really important to do that market research and to talk to actual people and find out what their actual emotional responses are. Because we can start to kind of dissect the sales process like a dead frog in the lab. And that doesn't tell us where the emotional narrative is. So we have to keep our finger on the pulse of both things.
Brilliant. And with that, Anshar, I just have 4 final questions for you.
Sure.
First one, what is the best piece of advice you were ever given?
People are not against you. They are for themselves. I think it was Francois de la Rochefoucauld that said, people are more often treacherous through weakness than they are through calculation. I think that, especially if you have a lot of challenges. I mean, because I was like 75% on with ASD until I was like 11. And I grew up in a house full of music teachers with sensory overload constantly. Like I've had a really interesting journey. I didn't get my driver's license until I was almost 40. I think that it's easy to identify adversaries, and we want to put a label on them so that we can discount their opinions, or that we can feel better about that, that adversarial relationship. Some of us have a lot of difficulty with the idea that someone doesn't like us, or that someone doesn't like what we do or doesn't want what we do. A lot of that process has a lot more to do with the internal system of validation and the internal belief system of that person trying to be happy and trying to chase the things that are important to them. And they've only learned the behaviors that they're assaulting with as a result of that narrative. And I think it can be really easy to take things personally. We try to get adversarial with people, but I think that when we can identify that they went through their own unique process, and that maybe it's a weakness or a misunderstanding in that process that's causing them to do a behavior that hurts us. I think once we stop taking things personally, we start to get more clarity. And I think that's one of the things that I love about psychology. And it's taught me more about myself too.
Share with us one thing on your bucket list.
I do a lot of speaking on neurodiversity in the workplace, on communication, on self-development, changing cognitive belief systems, reinventing yourself. Because I used to not talk to people, I have friends, and make eye contact with people. So I think that being recognized in public at random by someone who I've really touched, and that it's made a difference for them personally, that the suffering of the process and all the steps that I have to go through to reinvent myself, that process has saved someone else through going through that same process, and that it's touched them in some way. And I get to have a flashbulb memory of a stranger coming up to me and telling me how I've changed their life, and I get to hold on to that forever. Definitely bucket list worthy. That's
beautiful. When the toy companies finally get around to making an action figure of you, what 2 accessories will it come with?
Because I like puzzles and I get into complicated systems, and action figures are usually pantomimes of that, I suppose. There'll probably be a Rubik's Cube in one hand. And then I think having to come to terms with my own sensory processing disorder with autism has been a really big step for me. Being able to recognize my limits, keep myself recognizing so you can see what's taking me off, getting me closer to a meltdown, taking away my spoons, if you know what a spoon theory is. I'd say a blindfold. Because I think being able to get out of my own perspective and see the world through different eyes is one of the things that allowed me to step out of that place. So yeah, an affectation of my personality and an affectation of my process.
Love it. And last one, how do people find you?
Just a flashlight. I would say easiest way to find me is, I post a few select YouTube videos here and there, but I've learned something because I designed a completely integrated, online virtual selling system with a partner in the past. I've done, hundreds of hours of one-on-one sales, negotiation, marketing, coaching, all that kind of stuff. I have come to learn that if people don't seek you out, if people don't have their own impetus for contacting you and have their own interest, if they don't pay for advice, they're not willing to follow it. And so what I try to do, because I have the limit of it just being me, me being a consultant. And right now, I'm working with like 15 or 20 clients. I mean, that's almost my maximum load. So not only does someone need to be able to write me and be seeking out that information, already be bought in and know what my time is worth. But then I also have to take a look at all of my liabilities and responsibilities and make sure that I can devote the right amount of time to that person. And because my time is so important and personal to me, I use my email and that's it. I don't have some big, funnel, because I'm not trying to convert a bunch of people. When you start selling yourself, your own time, your own attention, the limited resource is you. And you have to decide what scaling looks like. Do I train 4 people underneath of them and have them start doing it? Do I try to encapsulate things in videos and get people to download it? And the kind of help that I offer is so personalized. Like I don't know if you know this or not, but I designed the psychological selling system that they use over at the legal brothels in Nevada now. And that is a completely different industry with different emotional concern.
And very specialized.
Yeah. And so, you can't just bundle that up and send it off in a multi-tiered email and try to increase your closing percentage. You have to dive and talk with that particular group of people about what the common objections are, what this narrative of the sale looks like. What are the core demographics? What are the most common situations that they find themselves in? What's challenging? What stands as an impediment to being able to up a customer's budget or build the emotional rapport or get rid of an adversarial relationship in that industry. And then it's only when you understand those own dynamics about your own business that the power of psychology, interpersonal dynamics and neuromarketing, all that is useful to you. So I only work with people who are self-aware enough to know that they need help and to see the value of my help. And if they can't see those things and they're not interested in buying me, I have no interest in working with them in the first place. And I like having that exclusivity. I've already, in 2 decades, have gotten to that place where people write me and I turn them down sometimes. And I like that. It empowers me to be able to take charge of my own schedule, to balance my own needs and my own time. But I think that it also creates the impact. And you have to think about your service, your good of your service. How does it impact people? I think that you have to personalize that. When you're going to, talk to people about, you can just sit and give a generic lecture on, sales. And, I'm not a motivational speaker in that way. I think that you have to understand how psychology can help you do what it is that you do. There's all kinds of different aspects to it too. What kind of colors do you use? What kind of psychological impressions does your website give? Are you using micro expressions? Have you taken time to take a look at some of the verbal crutches or gesticular crutches or facial crutches that you use when you're interacting with people, and are you able to see how that's affecting the emotional narrative? Are you recording, with the permission of the other person, your sales interactions so that you can take a look at the psychological impact of the communication after? Can you identify in that process whether well or what didn't? If a person knows that they need all of those things, the only way I'm going to be able to help them is with my email. And so that's just my first name and my last name with a period in the middle at gmail.com. Anshar Seraphim at gmail.com. And that's it. Really easy.
Love it. And thank you so much for spending time with us today. And thanks for everything.
Of course. Absolutely. And if you have any follow-up questions or if you get some requests for me to come back or something, I'm more than happy to do that.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for joining us. Once again, I'm Marlana Semenza, photographer and visual strategist. Please comment, like, or share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. For more information on how I can help you create your iconic image, visit marlanasemenza.com.